Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. I'm really delighted to be hosting this event, which is the launch of a new Freeman Chair report entitled Defining Success, Does the U.S. Need an End State for Its China Policy? This, as you'll hear throughout the conversation, this emerged from, I think, a growing chorus of analysts, policymakers, ex-policymakers who are wrestling with this issue of how do we steer the course of the U.S.-China bilateral relationship? Do we need to focus more on managing or creating a steady state in the relationship where there will be tension, but more or less trying to find some coexistence model between the two? Do we need to steer our China policy towards a more clearly defined end goal, whether that is something at the extreme, looking for a vision of regime change, whether that is looking for some sort of strategy on China that achieves U.S. outcomes that are clearly defined. This is really at the heart, I think, of our China policy debate right now. For this report, we gathered more than 20 analysts, ex-policymakers from across the spectrum, as well as some individuals representing international voices on this. And we brought together, I think, just a really fantastic product that you'll see for all of the discussion on there being a consensus on China in Washington, D.C. These essays will show you, I think, an important area of disconsensus, or at least where the debate is still emerging. So to help unpack the report, we are delighted to welcome four of the contributors to this on my far left, or for those of you watching on the right, just so I don't make a political comment. We have Richard Fontaine, the CEO of the Center for New American Security. To my immediate left, we have Rick Waters, the Managing Director for China at the Eurasia Group. To my right, Yun Soon, a Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the China Program at the Stimson Center. And all the way from Bangalore and not showing an ounce of jet lag is Manoj Kewalramani, who's a Fellow in China Studies and the Chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies Program at the Takshashila Institution. Welcome, everyone. Really appreciate your time, and thanks for your excellent contributions. Richard, if I can, I'd like to start with you. What I'll do is I'll just ask everyone to go around the horn and just give a 3 to 5 minute summary or re-summary of your argument in the paper, but also curious just about how you think about this question at a macro level. I think as we've all had discussions and back and forths, everyone was willing to contribute an essay. Some people, as Richard, you and I were just talking about, stuck the landing and answered the question precisely. Some people chose to find a landing spot to the side of the defined landing spot. Others chose to avoid it. But I think everyone in their own way was taking a stab at this. So just curious how you think about the question and where did you come down?
Yeah, well, thanks. And thanks for having us, and also congratulations on pulling this group of people together to have this debate, because I think it really does cut to the core of our own self-defined priorities in U.S. foreign policy, and as you noted, one on which there is neither widespread agreement and consensus nor really deep thought often. We sort of immediately get into the what are they doing and what are we going to do, as opposed to what it is that we're actually trying to achieve, what is the world that we would like to live in between the U.S. and China. So congratulations, which I think is a significant contribution to this debate. So maybe just starting, do we need a strategy? I think almost everyone would agree it'd be good to have a strategy if the U.S.-China competition is the key defining feature of the international environment now and in the future, and we should be pursuing a strategy that will lead toward an objective. That seems kind of self-evident to me. I guess this is a matter of some debate whether we need an objective at all, but I think that in the absence of an objective, in the absence of knowing what it is as a country we're trying to achieve in the relationship with China, then we're likely to waste resources, frustrate our attempts to track progress, elude the broad-based domestic support necessary to sustain a strategy. And our allies and partners wish and frankly deserve to know what it is that we are aiming at and what we're not aiming at in the U.S.-China competition. So, these good strategies articulate a desired end case, and then they kind of outline how to attain it. I tried to take a stab at landing in the landing zone now, which I think I landed in, whether I landed straight up and nailed the dismount.
Knees were bent, I will say.
Exactly. Maybe the audience can decide. But I think in order to identify what the objective of the U.S.-China our China policy should be, you have to start with really a big question, which is, what is the world that we want to live in the future? Because that world in the future will be affected by the U.S.-China competition and by that relationship. It is that weighty, it's that important. So the objective of U.S. policy flows from the kind of order that we wish to see obtain in the world, and frankly, the kind of order that China poses a threat to. So, generally speaking, the U.S. has sought to maintain a global order governed by rules rather than brute power, one where countries enjoy sovereignty, disputes are resolved peacefully, markets are open to trade, human rights are considered universal, democracy can flourish. America's own track record in upholding those principles, you can talk about how scattershot that has been over the years, but the principles under which we act in the world is largely rooted in that, and that is one of the reasons since the 1940s Washington has opposed hostile spheres of influence emerging in Eurasia, because they threaten this rules-based order that we wish to see obtained. So the overall goal of U.S. policy today should be to preserve the core pillars of the international order, even as specific rules and institutions adapt, and from that then you get the objective of U.S. policy toward China specifically, given that China does pose threats to some elements of the order. The aim of U.S. policy should be to ensure that Beijing is either unwilling or unable to overturn the regional and global orders. That admits for various scenarios. I mean, it's kind of abstract, but it is an objective. It is neither regime change on the one side nor accommodation on the other. It also admits for various scenarios. I mean, China might stop trying to upend the order because its leaders see the strengths of the countries that are committed to the principles and the vigor with which they oppose Chinese designs. Or they could even one day see a role for themselves and benefits for themselves in the preservation of elements of the order. Or they could become incapable of undermining the order because they're too weak, we're too strong, because its authoritarian vision doesn't prove popular in lots of other countries, because there's a relative strengthening of the powers that are committed to the liberal status quo, things like that. So there's various scenarios in which that could happen. And as I said, it rules out several other potential alternatives to that. You can imagine a medium-term policy agenda that would flow from this objective of ensuring that China is unable or unwilling to overturn the regional and global orders. But the first step in doing this is, I think, to understand what it is we're aiming at and not simply use, as we often do, descriptions of the nature of the relationship as our end state goal.
Just, Richard, a quick follow-up. Isn't not the case that most national security strategies start out with a big throat clear of this sort of broader international order that the United States wants to live in as being our sort of objective?
Well, I'll not take the term throat clear personally, but yes, they often do, although there are some differences between the description of the world, for example, in the Trump national security strategy and the Biden national security strategy and the Obama national security strategy. But it's that connection between the world we want and the objective we should have in our relationship with China that I think is the key here, because that is not often translated. And so if you ask members, officials in the administration often, sometimes they will sort of at least privately say, well, we don't need to get there yet. We don't need to envision an end state. We're so far from an end state. We shouldn't, even really necessarily have this debate. Others will say, well, it's competition or managed competition or competition within guardrails. But again, I don't think that we have a national project to aim at competition within guardrails. We have a national project to do things that will accrue to the interests and values of the United States, and that's preserving the elements of order that we want and defending those against China where it would transgress those.
Rick, I appreciate it. Everyone had a different approach to how they were answering this question. Yours also was unique in the sense that I think you were bringing or you're wearing the hat of someone who just left government and so has been working this issue from the inside. How did you think about the question at a conceptual level? And then I'd just like to hear the broad brush of how you went about answering it.
Well, I think what I saw from inside the system through two administrations, Trump and now Biden, was a struggle, right? I think when you're trying to reorient the ship of state, it's not easy. And China's a uniquely complex challenge because it doesn't lend itself to the clarity of a typical bilateral challenge or one that's bucketed to one domain. So I think we have to make allowances for the fact that this was going to be an iterative process, the fact that we're 8 years into the pivot to strategic competition and we're debating what the goals are tells us we haven't finished this process yet. The second thing that I saw up close is that I think as this sort of iterative process unfolded, the missing elements of it, the questions that remained, shaped in many ways, as Richard pointed out, debates on the Hill. They contributed to subtle hedging behaviors among our allies who assumed if there's no clear explanation of what our goal is, it must be regime change, or perhaps it was peaceful evolution, but very seldom would you get a different answer to that question if pressed. And then within the bureaucracy, I think the challenge is that, for much of the executive branch, the national security apparatus, people are coming in on rotational 2-year or 3-year assignments. They need a playbook, and that's not as simple as having a clear objective. It requires, I think, going beyond steady state formulations to more precision in each of the domains about what we want. The final piece, and I think here I've got a lot of humility on this question, is we have to at least consider how all this matters in China. It's still a quarter of humanity. We are all still debating basic questions of how much of the challenge is China from a realpolitik perspective, how much of it is the Communist Party, and how much of it is specific to this leader. And if we don't know the answer to those questions, I think we have to be modest about the impact of our rhetoric and strategic communication on a system we sometimes don't sufficiently understand. So where I came down in the end is that I think we would be best served by defining what it is we want. And I think we have to push past even some of the existing formulations that in the moment, and I think under this administration, might have been sufficient to pass domestic legislation and to rebuild alliances around a diagnostic theory of the case. Now we have to really be specific about when we say preserving the rules-based order, is the existing order sufficient? When the Security Council is paralyzed, when we're outnumbered in the GA, and when the battleground is now the UN specialized agencies and perhaps even the standard-setting bodies where governments are not present. The same is true if you go through almost every domain, security issues at a regional perspective, trade and technology, or the ways in which China's fear of a democratic-led order leads it to try to export aspects of its securitization agenda on the global stage. And so I think we have to look at all of these things and be clear about what our interests are, what our objectives are, but define them more in policy terms than in terms of the flavor of the regime on the other end.
He's not here, but Zach Cooper had an essay in this report thinking about phasing of how we move through this. And I guess my counterfactual to you is it really only possible for us to be having this conversation now? In other words, if earlier on in the Biden administration, they had, instead of outlining a sort of steady state, it's about strategic competition, which allowed people to fill in some of the blanks on their own, had instead forced a conversation of what a very clear goal was. Would that have worked? Would that have worked politically? Would that have worked within the U.S. government? Again, operating on the assumption that we're sort of moving from one paradigm of how we think about China, our relationship with China, to a much more competitive one. Was that a necessary sort of liminal phase?
It's hard to say, Jude. I mean, I think a lot of the framing was really built around pillars 1 and 2. It was about the domestic investments and about alignment. I think the Biden...
Pillars 1 and 2 of a Secretary of State's Blinken's invest-aligned compete.
So I think really the compete piece only became fully articulated towards the second half of Biden's term. And now we've seen what that looks like, especially after the November 2023 Woodside Summit. And that is, a kind of hybrid arrangement where you've got very contested areas of the relationship that you're just trying to manage within boundaries until some condition changes that might allow for a different relationship. But even within that, you have some narrow areas where the interests align and where you're cooperating. And that's very different from, for example, a regime change strategy. But how you label it and then how you spell out what the steady state means for allies and for bureaucracies often runs into the politics in DC. Because I would venture to say that what is happening in the counter-narcotics space right now is akin to a measure of coexistence.
Yoon, over to you. Again, same broad question, but also curious. You discussed this to some extent in your contribution, but also, a lot of your day job is as a keen observer of the discourse in Beijing and how Beijing is interpreting our actions. I'm curious how you see this conversation about end states or steady states affecting Chinese perception and Chinese strategy.
That's a great question because starting in 2018, we start to see the Chinese strategists asking this question: that great power competition, to what end? What is the end state that U.S. is trying to achieve? And I think they broadly categorize it into two categories. One is basically a contest for survival. I win, you lose. I live, you die. Or some level of coexistence, but with a clear hierarchy, that U.S. hegemony will be preserved, or China is going to surpass the United States and replace the United States as a hegemon. So those are the two main arguments that we see in China when they look at U.S. strategy. But I think it does help to shape how they see the end game or what they are trying to achieve with the United States. One thing that is interesting is that you see this consistent effort from Beijing rejecting the narrative of the bilateral relationship between U.S. and China as competitive. And you have to wonder why, that if this is competition as a matter of fact, why are you rejecting the facts? I think one, there's a domestic element. If it is competitive, then someone has to be responsible for the deterioration of U.S.-China relations, right? And when you ask that question, then, well, some leader will have to be responsible for it. And the other aspect of it is, I think the Chinese want to preserve some room for engagement or some room for positive spin, whether it's counter-narcotics or whether it is illegal immigrants from China, repatriation, law enforcement cooperation. I think they want to preserve that room for some positive interaction with the United States. We all understand where that came from. It came from a desire for transactionality. They want transactions, right? They want to leverage one issue against the United States for U.S. concessions on another. But that also reflects, I think, in their view, that this competition does allow for room for some cooperation, maybe on technical level or on tactical level, that under a primarily adversarial or competitive relationship, there's still the possibility to manage the bilateral relations in a way that is constructive.
You just referenced the fact that Beijing, at least in external propaganda, says it doesn't accept the framing of competition. I think you scratch that about a nanometer, and you see that the conversation in Beijing fully accepts that this is a pretty brutal, entrenched, multifaceted competition with the United States. Yeah. I'm curious, to what extent do you think adopting one or the other approach on our side would in any positive way affect China's perceptions? If the United States, obviously understanding that if we were to accept an end state of regime change, which I don't think anyone is articulating, but had a much clearer vision on the victory of the United States in consolidating its position and strengthening the liberal international order, leaving open space for coexistence with China, but nonetheless having what I think would be an approach to articulating victory which Beijing would find untenable. Or we take what for us would seem to be the softer approach maybe of competition. I don't see either of those really working for Beijing. So it seems like we're damned if we do, damned if we don't, in any way that is realistic here in the United States.
I think that is very true. We had a very long history of engagement, trying to shape China, trying to change China, right? And I would say that China did not believe what we said, and they still believe that we want color revolution, we want to use peaceful evolution to change China and to make China more like us. That's what our experience had been. And then now we say that, well, it's competitive, but we still aim for some level of coexistence. And I think in their view, it is translated directly into, okay, this is new Cold War. That there's no, very little space remaining for a collaborative or cooperative other than transactional relationship. I think there is a tendency in Beijing to interpret directions of US policy in the worst possible scenario, in the worst possible scenario. But I think what it also means is that if there's a tendency in Beijing to interpret the worst intention out of the United States, then what we say is our intention, what we proclaim as our end game, is not necessarily going to be the single factor that matters the most. Eventually, I really like the term the national quality or the contest of national quality used by George Kennan, because it is about competition and it is about the resilience of our state and our society, how competitive we are, how victorious we will be in this competition, and how resilient the Chinese state and society will be, right? And that is not a question that we can define from the very beginning, because that quality can only be revealed in that process of competition. And I agree with Rick that it's interactive and it's also reflective. And we can influence their perception, but in the end, it's going to be the reflection of who the nation is and how successful we can be in this competition. Which is why that I always feel that, well, end state or end game, but we're not at the end of the game. We're at the beginning of the game. And to define the end game from the very beginning runs a risk, well, self-fulfilling prophecies, and we see this argument a lot, that, well, what you define as your end game is going to affect how China reacts to it. That's true. And it could be an over-measurement of what we're trying to achieve. Because what if the Chinese society and the Chinese state is actually not that resilient? That we overstate our goal and run the risk of overcommitment of resources. So I feel that in the end, for us to define the end game is going to be after a process of the competition, of the interaction, and then we can truly measure that what is China's national quality and what is ours.
Manoj, I'd like to turn to you. I think what made this report especially interesting, aside from the fine contributions of all the Americans, was bringing in some global perspective. And of course, I think everyone in Washington understands this is no longer a two-player game. That for both China and the United States, thinking about third countries is essential. So we had contributions from people from the European Union, from the United Kingdom, from Taiwan, and of course from India. So first of all, just curious how you entered into answering this question. I know your first thought was, well, why am I contributing to a report about should the U.S. have an end state or goal? But I thought you had a really fascinating answer to that. So I'd love to hear just how you think about where this question we're having here intersects with India's interests. And then also I'll have a follow-up on some of the work you're doing to try to answer what is India's vision of victory or end state in regards to China.
Thanks so much, Jude. And again, thanks so much for having me as part of this report at this panel. I think, it was a useful exercise. The more I thought about it, the more I thought it was interesting and worth doing. I came at the question from primarily an Indian interest perspective, because I just don't think I could put on an American hat and do this. What I tried to do was I tried to see where our interests converge, where there is congruence, where do our interests converge, and try to sort of apply that lens. The answer that I came up with was not necessarily an end state, so I agree with some of what's been said, that I don't think we need to necessarily define a clear end state. But from an Indian interest perspective, the answer that I came up with was that sustained yet contained competition between the US and China is something that works for India. Why is that the case? Primarily because, like it's already been said, the US and China are the chief protagonists of the international order today. Half of the world's defense spending comes from these two countries. They account for over 40% of the global GDP. There are deep economic and technological bonds that exist, which are fraying, which are stressed, but they still continue to exist. There is obviously this deep sense of systemic competition that seems to be increasingly baked in both systems, even in the Chinese system. At the same time, there are limitations in what both can do in terms of shaping the international order. The ability of the US to be able to achieve outcomes through expressions of power like we saw in the 1990s and even in the early 2000s seems to have altered. Likewise, I don't think Beijing has the ability to seriously shape international order through different instruments of statecraft, whether it's force, whether it's economic tools. There are limitations to that. And both have also a certain stake in the international order that exists as of now. Although, yes, there are revisions that are taking place, like Rick talked about, at different levels. So when India looks at that, India says, look, if this competition was to devolve into conflict, into some sort of Cold War akin to the Cold War that we had in the past, given the nature of India's relationship with the US and China, where the US is an indispensable partner and China is a massive neighbor which has demonstrated hostile intent, but with whom you eventually have to live because geography does not change, unless, of course, the tectonic plates shift, but that's going to be a long time away. So you have to find some sort of space for action between these two. A Cold War puts you potentially on the front lines. You don't want to be there. It adversely affects India's interest in terms of its development goals, in terms of its goals to emerge as a global power. Likewise, any sort of acquiescence by the United States of China's primacy in Asia is again something that doesn't sit well with India. India desires a multipolar Asia. It can't be a global power if Asia is unipolar. So anytime there's a meeting between President Biden and Xi Jinping or any of the American presidents going forward also, in the past there used to be lots of newsprints in India which was spent on the idea of a G2 emerging and anxiety. Nowadays it's no longer as much newsprint, but it's a lot of WhatsApp forwards which are circulating. So you have this anxiety still, there's an undercurrent of this anxiety that exists because that again adversely affects India's interests. So some degree of sustained yet contained competition works for India because it also opens up new opportunities for cooperation with the United States and for negotiation with China. If I just go back 4 years, in 2020, there was no Quad Leaders Summit that was taking place until what the PLA did on the frontier in eastern Ladakh. There was no ban on Huawei. We were discussing that ban on Huawei in our 5G systems for a couple of years, but there was no forward movement. And then Xi Jinping forced our hand. So I think that the stresses that this situation creates also creates opportunities for India. And that's where I think India would like the situation to sustain. In my recommendations in the essay, I'm of the view that yes, there needs to be coexistence, but that coexistence does not necessarily mean that there doesn't need to be friction. I think the United States needs to, and has been, and needs to continue to push boundaries with Beijing, because I think Beijing is pushing boundaries through the use of force. I think there might be a process where you go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and that's fine. It might seem ungainly, but it's fine because that's the kind of world that we live in. Yet, I think there have to be mechanisms for conflict management, escalation management. And finally, again, from an Indian interest point of view, at the heart of this strategy has to be the United States working with allies and partners and a broad coalition of partners. India is unlikely to ever be a formal ally, a treaty ally, but India is likely to be an extremely close partner. I think Eric Garcetti, the ambassador to India, frequently refers to the idea of India and US as two countries, as two who have started dating but yet not committed. I think we're likely to stay in that situation for some time. That situationship is likely to persist. But that does not mean that we can't be really close. And I think that's the way that India would like to see that. If that relationship helps boost India's capability to deal with China's ability to coerce, but also India's ability to pursue its own interests, and thereby shape a multipolar Asia, which I think on the basis of values the United States and India share, is in the interest of both the US and India.
I'm being cursed for making a joke about throat clearing because now I'm having to cough every 2 minutes. But can I ask you what we were talking about just off camera, that now you're doing some work on thinking about India's question around end states in China. So it might just be interesting for listeners and for us here to hear about what the state of that debate is, how much thinking is there happening about specific goals, whether that is creating steady-state equilibriums, whether that is thinking about a more defined set of what victory or success looks like in India's management of the relationship? Just curious what the state of that conversation is.
I think it's still early days in that conversation. I think that it's really strange, right? I mean, India has been dealing with China, or China has been dealing with India. They have been dealing with each other for a couple of thousand years. They've been neighbors for quite a long time. Yet I think we're in a new sort of state where volatility is likely to be the nature of the relationship. And that's for many reasons. That's for structural reasons like India and China both rising, although at differential levels in some ways. There's a power differential. But both have risen, both have greater capacity to pursue their interests, both have greater political will in their systems to pursue their interests. And that greater capacity leads to friction. So for example, on the boundary, once there's better infrastructure, both the soldiers are engaging much more with each other because previously they couldn't reach those places. At the same time, there is a power asymmetry. And as much as that power asymmetry is there from an economic point of view and the resources that one can therefore bring to bear, it's also there from a firepower point of view. But again, that to me, that is limited because firepower asymmetry depends on terrain, location, so on and so forth. But it's also in the mind. I think Beijing sees itself as a major power and India as an inferior regional power. And therefore, it chooses to coerce because why would an inferior regional power inhibit a major power's expression of what it believes is its due sort of space in Asia? And finally, of course, the nature of the US-China relationship. So for those reasons, volatility and friction is part of the relationship. I think in India, we talk about arriving at a new modus vivendi with China. It's essentially undefined right now, but the idea is to try and find a steady state where both can learn to coexist and friction can be managed because friction is likely to be there. I think the current discourse in India is around figuring out how do you address the development versus security dilemma with China. And I think there's lots of parallels in that in terms of what's happening in the US, what's happening in Europe. But we're still sort of figuring that out. We're in early stages of that conversation.
I might just linger in the allies and partners piece for a minute to see if anyone has anything to add. I think a question just to all of you, and Richard, start with you, is as we move forward, we're going to have a change of administration one way or the other. So a chance to reevaluate how we conceptualize and articulate a China strategy. How large of a role, what percentage should we be incorporating how we articulate a China strategy factoring into conversations in New Delhi and Canberra and Tokyo and Berlin, the allies and partners that matter, how much should that weigh in these conversations, especially when we have a hard enough time mobilizing, consolidating here? I mean, that's some complex trigonometry, but just how large a role do you think that should play? And how we even define and articulate that end state?
Well, I think that is the allies and partners aspect of this is a reason to articulate the end state, because we may be convinced that either we know what we're after or we don't need yet to figure out what we're after. And we may also conclude that no matter what we say to the Chinese, they won't buy it one way or the other. But that still leaves a lot of countries out there that are very uncertain about the nature of this relationship and what overall US intentions are today, pursuant to some objective down the line. Some countries will think, depending on who's in the administration, this is all about regime change, however clothed that may be in other verbiage and things like that. If you go back far enough, people worried in the region about a G2 world in which there was a combination that would cut them out. Now, there wasn't much for that really there either, but some of this stems from mentally filling in the blanks where those blanks exist, and by articulating what it is that we want to achieve, then we can bring our allies and partners hopefully closer on board with that vision and bring it to a vision that is also closer to them. Because if the vision is we Americans win and they lose, or we Americans and they Chinese get together and work it all out, or whatever your formulation may be, then the obvious question for many allied partners, what the hell should I join you in that enterprise, right? The point is not that we're trying to defeat China per se. We're standing for something. We're standing for the principles that have benefited the United States and our allies and partners in many other countries, by the way, including China, quite well over the years. We want to preserve those things: freedom of the commons, non-proliferation, human rights, trade, things like that. And so, this affirmative, positive vision that goes beyond us and beyond China per se, I think is a key to having our allies and partners be allies and partners in this endeavor.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time on this issue in my last job, and what I would say is beyond even just the objectives, I mean, if you go by domain, in the security realm, in every domain, the U.S. cannot achieve its objectives without some degree of alignment with allies and partners. So, in the security realm, yes, the U.S. is still the predominant provider of security globally. In the Indo-Pacific region, of course, that's a big point of friction with China, but we have to be honest that even in that area where there's been convergence with India, with Japan, with the Philippines, that security architecture will not be available to the U.S. to pursue any objective. And when you look at other domains, trade and traditional economic interaction, the world you described is the one that I perceive. The U.S. is 20%, the EU is about 22%, but it doesn't grow. China is 16%, and the battle is over the remaining 42%. And so who defines the norms? Who controls the architectures? That's a critical question, and unfortunately, because of our domestic politics, we are not really in that game today. Technology, and I'll just end with this one. I was very struck by the Special Competitive Studies project. They put out their semi-annual rack and stack of where China is dominant, where the U.S. is dominant, and what areas are contested. And the reality is that the world is kind of a 70-30 place now, where yes, the U.S. and its allies control the technological frontier in most areas, but not all. And as we look at the direction of travel on renewables, it's very plausible to see a world in which China is the standard setter, Europe is in China's tech stack, and the U.S. is left out in the cold. So in all of these areas, I think that it's not just the objective, it's also the ability to set steady state realistic goals and then constantly assess those goals against the realities that are emerging, because we may well have to recalibrate.
Any thoughts on allies and partners? But then I had a follow-up question for you.
I do have just one observation, because I'm a China analyst, so I watch where China is, how they process information, what is the logic of their policy, and I think this concept, this rule-based international order, I think a fundamental element of contention or of debate is U.S. hegemony a part of that rule-based international order? I think that's a fundamental question that defines the tension between U.S. and China, right? And the Chinese will say that, well, yeah, rule-based international order, UN is what we respect, UN Charter is what we enshrine, but this U.S. hegemony is not part of the international order as we know, but U.S. is trying to project it or define it as a part of the rule-based international order. I don't think there's a clear answer either here or in Beijing as for how to answer this question. But I just want to make a note that this is a part of the fundamental issue or the fundamental conflict as I research on Chinese grand strategy and their foreign policy. And it also helps to, I guess, question where our allies and partners are, right? Europe has a very close trade relationship with China. The tension is growing. But when we see, like, for example, how the Chinese approach the Europeans, part of the argument is that U.S. has a hegemony to protect. You don't. So why are you in this fight, right? Why are you protecting basically a geopolitical competition between U.S. and China, where U.S. is trying, well, it's basically a competition for primacy. And Europe does not, well, in the Chinese argument, does not have a fight in it. So I find that angle is potentially not sufficiently explored in the policy narrative and in the studies that we do.
You mean here in the United States?
I think in the United States we conveniently ignore that question. I think we just have a blanket statement that of course we're on the same side. Of course, this is a rule-based international order, but we don't try to deliberate what the differences are, or whether the differences actually exist.
And can you walk me through what is the distinction for Beijing? If U.S. hegemony isn't baked into a rules-based order, what does that mean for China one way or the other?
I think the
It
Chinese
can
would,
tolerate a rules-based international order that is liberal and open if the United States is not sort of playing a dominant role in sustaining it?
I think for them, whether the rule-based international order is by default free and open is also subject to debate. Because in the Chinese narrative, when they look at the number of democracies and look at the total number of countries in the world, well, who really represents the majority, right? Who is really the mainstream opinion in the world? I think the Chinese do question that, and they're going to question it even more as we progress with this great power competition. But I think this element, because the Chinese essentially, they believe in power politics. They believe that power is a foundation for international politics. So, and they also see the world as hierarchical, no matter what they say about, well, small or big or strong or weak, we're all equals. No, we're not. So for them, this competition with the United States defines a lot of their goals and also their behavior. Which is why that when they hear the term rule-based international order, they're not necessarily thinking about liberalism. They're not necessarily thinking about free trade. They're thinking about, well, is U.S. hegemony on top of that order? Is that part of what the Western enterprise is trying to advance? And I think they would question that premise.
Manoj, I wanted to return to something you had mentioned earlier, which to me strikes me as the sort of Goldilocks theory of U.S. presence in the world, where not too much, not too little.
Yeah.
And I think you hear that from countries in the region where the dial is cranked to too much. There's shock, horror. The United States is being belligerent. If that dial is turned down too much, there's horror at a neo-isolationist the United States. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on how you see that debate playing out across. I mean, you're traveling around the region. Are you hearing? It almost seems like there is, to some extent, we're in a sweet spot. I don't think any country wants a U.S.-China competition because the possibility of it spinning off the rail is plausible. But at the same time, if we're in it, we're in this nice space right now because you have essentially two buyers in the United States and China. That, as you were just mentioning, in India's relationship, India and I think there's a number of other countries who are trying to position themselves to extract benefits either in the security or their economic domain. I'm not sure the competition will always stay in that Goldilocks zone, but just curious your thoughts. Do you see it the same way, and who is playing that Goldilocks space particularly well?
I'd like to say India is playing that space pretty well, but that would be hubris. I think that if I was to the first point that you made, that that there's this concern about the U.S. being too assertive. I think there's lots more that the U.S. can do and should do. I don't think I think it's just barely begun to scratch the surface in the region, particularly from an economic point of view. And that, to me, is the biggest challenge, is the internal debate within the United States about U.S. economic policy, U.S. trade policy. I think data policy, data security policy, data governance policy. It's those kind of things that will actually permit the United States to engage much more actively within the region. The Quad is one instrument through which it has done more, but I think there's a lot more that can be done, and I think countries in the region will actually be open and willing to engage with the U.S. much more. The issue comes when it comes to force presence, and that also, I think that there would be, if I just look at India. 10 years ago, I would not have necessarily seen an Indian foreign minister talk about the US, France, Australia as legitimate stakeholders in the Indian Ocean region who have the right to sort of have expressions of power in the region. Today, that's changed, right? So I think that there is far greater appetite than they may be assumed in here. In terms of countries, look, as much as, yes, countries are hedging and they may be cutting good deals here and there, there's also tremendous pressure. I was in Malaysia some time back, and I kept hearing from the semiconductor industry in Malaysia about how much of a stressful job it is to manage exports because the United States has been shifting benchmarks on what kind of chips are restricted. So it's not necessarily all easy going for them. I think the countries that are doing well, The countries that are doing well are places like India, places in Southeast Asia who've done really well in terms of this hedging. And I think that's partly because they've had a history of dealing with China. And particularly Southeast Asia has a history of dealing with the United States also, and has deep business linkages also. So I think that yes, they wouldn't necessarily want to see things escalate into conflict, but I think on certain domains, at least again from an Indian perspective, I think it's welcome that the United States is pushing certain boundaries with China, because China is going to push boundaries in terms of use of force. The nature of its use of force with regard to Taiwan has changed. The nature of its use of force in South China Sea has changed. The nature of its use of force with India has changed. And none of that respects even necessarily UN law, right? So as much as we may debate the rules-based order. And so therefore, I think it's, from my point of view, I think it's much more welcome that the United States is pushing certain boundaries. And again, it probably will be a process of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and then you recalibrate. And to me, that's fine. Again, the caveat is that nobody wants escalation into conflict, but unless you push some of those boundaries, or to use a phrase that Xi Jinping uses, unless you explore extreme case scenarios, you're not really going to get to find out where your boundaries are.
We've only got about 15 minutes left. I want to just change the topic slightly here. And Richard, I wanted to ask you about the role of public communication on China and China strategy and how that matters. I'm struck by one of the quote-unquote advantages of just framing this as a new Cold War, even if we're a bit fuzzy about what our 1989, 1991 moment looks like, is it is a clear message that has some resonance with the US public. It doesn't require much additional explanatory language, and it fits in many ways the broad parameters of what we're dealing with. We have 2 big rival superpowers, one a democratic market economy, the other run by a Leninist, one-party communist state. This is a multi-domain global competition. One of the challenges, I think, with the Biden administration's approach, although I thought it was largely effective, is it requires a lot of caveats and a yes, but, and this and to be able to communicate even just how the allies and partners piece, matters to U.S. strategy. So again, if we're thinking about a new administration coming in and how we should just even communicate on China policy, do you have any thoughts on what might be some building blocks of that? And how would we take a more sophisticated strategy on China and find ways that we're going to communicate that such that policymakers, when they're meeting with voters, are getting buy-in to potentially be raising taxes, to be spending more on the military, to be fixing our defense industrial base? Again, I'm sorry to belabor this question, but getting folks serious about doing big structural changes around defense industrial base doesn't always work if you have a China not as 10 foot tall, but China is 5'9".
It's a great question. And I think, as you say, the easy way is to say, we've been in a Cold War before, we're in a new one now. We have to do all these things, and we have to do them as soon as possible, or the communists are going to win. But that, I think, is a bad approach for a number of reasons. One, I think just in terms of policy making, I'm not a big fan of the Cold War analogy. Certainly there's some things that sort of rhyme and lessons with the Cold War and lessons that one can derive, but there's also plenty of differences, including the economic integration and the unlikelihood that there's a Gorbachev sort of waiting in the wings and all kinds of other things. And so you end up clouding your thinking potentially as much as you clarify it when you talk to, especially publicly, about what will be necessary. Certainly the presence of an external threat motivates America, or the perceived presence of an external threat motivates Americans to spend resources and undertake activities that they wouldn't in the absence, right? So we started during the Cold War, started during the War on Terror, and sometimes it's very far afield from what the actual thing is, right? The interstate highway system was to win the Cold War in some ways, right? They invented the internet, GPS, all these things. During the War on Terror, we doubled the foreign aid budget because of this sort of theory that more development aid would mean less terrorism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what you see now is the perception of a threat from China already making things possible that would not have been possible domestically just a few years ago. If you want $50 billion for semiconductors, you can get it. You couldn't get that a few years ago, and you couldn't get it if you just said, well, it's really good because these are the kind of industries of the future, and you know, we like Arizona a lot, and you know, things like that. You would have to say, you know, no, we're doing this because we're motivated to do it, right? If you want all of the sort of defensive economic measures we put in place on export controls or any of this other stuff, you can get it. What can you not get? Well, you can't get, so far, a big increase in defense spending. You can't get a trade policy, an affirmative, proactive trade policy. You can't get huge changes to legacy weapons systems, and you can't get a strategic immigration policy that would say, in order to compete more effectively with China, we'll get the best people from all over the world and they'll contribute to our economy rather than anybody else's, right? Because those are politically too hard. The question is whether, as the perception of China's threat increases, you can start to achieve some of those things that I think are necessary in order to be successful. Certainly the way you frame the China threat or the China challenge and our objective can make that more likely. But again, like, you have to be careful, right? I mean, you don't want McCarthyism in this country again, right? You can go too far. And you also inject anxiety into the body politic where it is not necessarily warranted. So there's a balancing act here to be, I think, objective and realistic and clear with the American people about what the threat is and what the stakes are, but in a realistic way that will try to motivate them to support policies that we believe are necessary to deal with this, but not go overboard and either turn inward with their hostilities or go around and, you know, having people duck under their desks again like they did in the 1950s.
I ask you to build on Richard's point here, and especially, again, just having recently been in the bowels of policymaking. Lessons learned and also guidance or advice for any incoming administration on, I think, I was going to call it the Goldilocks, but how do you find that balance of sufficient attention to the real world, realistic threats China presents, but sufficient to also mobilize resources to be able to tackle those. But on the other hand, not finding this tipping over into, you know, 1950s McCarthyite scare, which can lead to a distraction, a misuse of expenditures on non-existent threat A instead of real threat B.
Yeah, well, I think you need an inside voice and an outside voice. I think the outside voice has to speak to a lot of what Richard talked about. You need to find a line between, you know, mobilization, which is what we're talking about here, and pushing things too far. Because I do worry, industrial policy, we are in that game now. It's essential, but the constituencies and the interest group politics that come with it, the waste, the fact that it hasn't thus far really been an unadulterated success, even in the semiconductor space, if you look at Intel stock. So we have to be cautious about how far we are pushing in a fiscal environment where there are different constraints from where the Trump administration came in years ago. I think the inside voice that I'm talking about, I think, is almost more critical, because when I look back at the foundational documents, you know, the NSC 68s and the subsequent documents that were articulated at the beginning of the Cold War, what they did, and they changed over time, is they walked the executive branch and the national security bureaucracy through the logic of why certain strategic options were not available and why the one that was chosen was decided. But then it went further and touched on every aspect of national policy, including fiscal and taxation. And I think that's what we really need now, is to go beyond just the top level framing to something that your typical U.S. ambassador in a third country understands at that degree of fidelity. So those ambassadors and the other 1,400 parts of the executive branch who have some legal or regulatory or communication authority related to China understand what we're doing. Because I think if you don't have that, there is a little bit of a risk that you have an everything everywhere all at once dynamic that can contribute to the waste you highlighted in your article.
Any other thoughts on just the mobilization issue, why we're on it? Anything, again, you're having a similar conversation in India in some ways.
I mean, my only sort of concern would be, particularly with industrial policy, is there are two perennial challenges of industrial policy. One is there can be tremendous mission creep. We see that in India also. We have something called the PLI schemes. And I would have hoped that would have been restricted to certain strategic or critical sectors. Unfortunately, we also have toys in them. So, there can be mission creep, which can lead to lots of wasted resources. And secondly, particularly from a US point of view, is that it shouldn't, we've heard friend-shoring, near-shoring, it shouldn't end up becoming autarky. And that, I think, would be detrimental to broader US strategic interests as much as it would be to Indian interests.
We've only got a few minutes left, and I want to end early. So let me just ask a hypothetical question, which is, I think reading across all the essays, you just cut through it. I think almost everyone has some model of coexistence with China. I don't think anyone is talking about sort of defeat. I don't think anyone was talking about regime change. There's various models of how coexistence works. I think some people want more friction and see more friction as necessary for achieving that model. I think some people wanted a degree of concession to China as a way to release some pressure and find coexistence. But nonetheless, I think despite Xi Jinping's fever dream, there is no, as far as I can tell, peaceful evolution, color revolution, regime change strategy here in the United States. So I'm curious, Manoj, maybe I'll start with you. 15 years, you pick up in the book on how the United States navigated this incredibly dangerous, tenuous period, how it worked with its allies and partners, India, to do so. What is going to be, do you think, the sort of most important element of what India and the United States got right to be able to manage that fraught process of coexistence with a very powerful autocratic rival?
I would say two things. Firstly,
you don't even have to think about it.
I would say two things. Firstly, providing an economic alternative, a vision for prosperity for not just the United States and India, but also for countries in the region, linking them to your prosperity. I think that would be critical. The second thing would be being able to provide sufficient capacity or build sufficient capacity among regional actors that they blunt China's ability to coerce. If those are the two things that you're able to do, I think you're able to shape a regional architecture and therefore a global architecture where you can coexist much more peacefully.
You?
Oh, well, in 15 years, presumably China will be under a different leader.
Xi Jinping's only 71. That's young by our standards here in the United States for a leader.
We'll find out. But I think in that 15 years, what will essentially determine the result of this competition is how well China can endure the pressure, both internally and externally. And we're seeing a lot of that manifestation internally and externally. But interestingly, while we talk about this theory of diversionary warfare, that China might resort to a foreign crisis in order to divert the attention from its domestic failure, so far we haven't seen that. And diversionary warfare, if you think about the CCP's experience, is not a model that they would prioritize, but not to say that it's completely impossible. So I think it will be interesting to observe that in this process of competition, with more pressure that we exert on China, both in terms of the technology domain and the economic domain, as well as diplomatically and politically in the region, how well China can sustain that pressure. I think that will be the focus of the contest and the competition.
Rick?
Well, my dream are the four things that Richard mentioned on the US side. And on the Chinese side, imagine a world in which China has more demand for its own products. The overcapacity issue starts to erode as a point of friction. And because they're focused more on maximizing the welfare of their domestic citizens, this securitization of everything, the prioritization of S&T, it's still going to be there in all of our systems, but it isn't the dominant gene. That's a very different environment within which to shape US policy than the one we face today. So I think you need both.
Yeah, I would just say I think the defining feature on the American side is going to be the degree to which we bolster our own position. We've been talking about that, but for two reasons. One, because a more powerful United States active can bring about these kinds of objectives we were talking about before. Better deter war with a stronger military, et cetera, but also because we should be aiming to disabuse Chinese leaders and anybody else from the notion that America and the West Day is done and the next day is China's, and this is just sort of an inexorable feature of the way the world is going, and people are going to have to get used to it whether they like it or not. And you can expect the West to cling to its privileges and prerogatives, but it's sort of going down. So bet on the right side, and there's good reasons to think that that is inaccurate. But we also sometimes will feed the other side of that as well. I mean, on the Chinese side, I think that there are relatively simple for an American to say, but simple modifications that they could make that would take a significant amount of tension out of the system. So, for example, if they return to, yes, we want reunification with Taiwan, but if it takes 100 years, that's fine by me. That would be quite different than the current posture of the Chinese government. So, we can sort of say that. I would just say, it's easier to obviously look at the American side. When you look at like things that we might get right, I think we have all of the underlying things we need. We have the economy, the military, the geography, the innovation, the alliances, the global posture, the values. We have all, just augment all that. Yeah, sure. We have everything we need to obtain the kind of objectives we're talking about in this big competition with China. The question is whether we're going to put them together in the right way, on the right timeline that is going to be effective. And I wish there was less of a question mark around that than there is, but I guess I'm optimistic overall.
And I think for a conversation on U.S.-China, that will count as a very optimistic way to end. So
Agreed.
I want to thank you, Richard, Rick, Manoj. Thank you for your contributions to the report. Thanks for your time today. Thanks to everyone for watching. If I hadn't said this at the outset, the report is available on the CSIS website on the homepage now, so do hope that you take time to read it. It is well worth reading, so thanks to everyone.
Thank you.